Hi, welcome to teaching unit number 3, optimal and non-optimal performance, psychophysiological states, and stress recovery balance. My name is Franzi Lautenbach, and today I want to talk to you about stress recovery balance. So let's start first talking about stress. Why is it even important that we consider this phenomenon of stress? Well, because everyone who has participated ever in a competition has probably experienced some sort of physical changes or different thoughts that pop into your head, such as, oh my God, I'm gonna lose and no one is gonna ever like me again. So we feel like, oh man, we could lose our social status when we lose, also in a competition. And depending on which level you're competing, you might also think, oh man, if I'm gonna lose, I'm gonna lose a lot of money, I don't know what to do. And so basically, stress in sport is very, very common, and it is also very important, which we'll be discussing in a second. And it also, since it is normal, it is important that we think about it, but it's also important to know that it can impact performance in many different ways. That's the one part. And also, when we think about stress, it is a common problem in our world. Everybody is stressed out, everybody feels exhausted at some point. There are issues of burnout and so on. So it's not only relevant to talk about stress itself, but of course, on the other hand, to talk about recovery. So we put this together and I will briefly go through this. So stay with me. We're first gonna define stress. And when we think about stress, or the word stress, we can actually define it from two different perspectives. And this is quite interesting. From a biological perspective, where stress is actually a physiological change and an adaptation to actually mobilize relevant energy. So if we think about it, stress from a biological perspective is quite important. For example, well, always, it's always the same example, but, if there's an animal or if, for example, you see someone on the street that you don't feel, you feel a bit, oh, I don't know, it's late at night, you're on your own, so you feel kind of this physiological change, your heart starts to beat, for example, and you feel this rush of energy. It is important that you have this rush of energy to mobilize yourself in terms of you want to run faster or you want to go quicker to the other side of the street. So from a biological perspective, stress is quite important. The psychological perspective, on the other hand, it's still important. It's just a different definition. So stress is if the maintenance or the re-establishment or establishment itself of a favorable situation appears to be at risk. What does that mean? It means you are in a competition, you are behind, the other opponent is in tennis, for example, leading 4-0. So you're like, this is not a favorable situation. And in terms of, okay, I'm losing, and I'm losing also status, I'm losing potential money. In your head, you might also lose your friends. So you feel stressed out. And this is from a psychological perspective something that can be considered negative. But if you think about both definitions, stress is not only negative. Here it's just, you have physiological reactions and you have psychological reactions. Physiological reactions mainly refer to what is happening in your body, and the psychological ones mainly happening what's in your head. So what kind of thoughts are running through your head. And it's quite important that you always have to keep in mind that both type of reactions, they go hand in hand. It's quite easy if you think about it. When you have a physiological change, so your heart starts to beat very fast because you're in a stressful situation, you might want to know what is happening, what is going on, and you then only realize, oh, it's because this person that I like so much just entered the room. Oh yes, it's true, and I really like him because my body reacts in a certain way. So you have going from a physiological reaction, you think about what's happening, and then you have the psychological reaction. It is also the other way around. You could lay in bed at night and start thinking about your death or death of family members, all kinds of deaths And all of a sudden your heart starts to race and your palms might start to sweat. Because what's happening in your mind has an impact on what's happening in your body. And this is quite important to know. As I said, stress is not generally bad, and this is also what Hans Selye already discovered way back in the days, and he defined eustress and de-stress. And actually, if we think about the common use of stress, everybody is just stressed and it's always negative. But some stress is important because if you don't have the energy to perform a certain task, you will, well, very likely not perform the task very well. But on the other hand, this stress is important. Otherwise, you wouldn't even be able to start performing because your motivation and your physical level of arousal would not be high enough to get going or to even get out of bed. So this eustress is quite important and has beneficial effects not only for your health and your motivation, but also for performance and well-being. The distress is, I guess, this what we talk about in common terms when everybody refers to stress as this negative type, and has negative implications, which we'll come to in a second again. The symptoms of such distress can be differentiated into different categories. I defined for this lecture those for the physiological, behavioral, and psychological / cognitive. That's why they're a bit closer together. So physiologically, it makes sense if you think about what are my reactions when I'm in an acute stressful situation. Some people start to sweat their hands, or they have high blood pressure, their heart is pumping. They even get sometimes a nervous stomach. Some people do have that, and they need to go to the bathroom all the time. Sometimes you feel that your breathing is changing, so you see that you have this physiological reaction. On a behavioral level, meaning what can be also observed from the outside, but well, we all can observe from the outside if you're sweating very, very, very much. But on a behavioral level, you see people chew nails and they're kind of hectic and they don't know what to say and they're kind of just jittery all around, and they're, for example, talking very fast or walking very fast, and this then actually leads to mistakes in coordination. So on a behavioral level, if you know people very well, you can see very quickly if they actually are stressed. And then we have the psychological cognitive aspect. Psychologically, if you're stressed, and please be honest to me and to yourself, we've all had this, you're irritated very easily and you sometimes get angry very quickly if you're in a hurry, if you have a deadline to make, and then someone comes up and is maybe even in a good mood and wants to ask you questions and wants to have even small talk with you, and you're just very frustrated and you really want to get going, and this is quite annoying. And you get very anxious and you get nervous, and your thoughts, you're trying to listen to this person, but your thoughts are somewhere else. So this is sometimes happening on a psychological level, and cognitively, then of course this makes sense that you have a lack of concentration and a lack of perception of what's going on around you. This is very common, this makes a lot of sense, and those symptoms, they vary of course from person to person. And that's why it's always important when working with athletes, or even when working with yourself or on yourself, that you know what kind of symptoms you have, because sometimes stress comes so fast and it grabs you and pulls you down the drain and you don't even know what to do. So it is important that you know the symptoms you have when you are stressed, so that you can say, stop, I want to change what's going on now, and I have a way to get out of it. So that's the more of a practical advice. And now we're going to come and talk about theoretical approaches when it comes to stress. I want to talk to you about 3 approaches that I find not only me, but a lot of even way more important people than me find quite important and relevant. Those are reaction-oriented models. They focus basically on what's happening when we are stressed. So stress for them is a reaction. Then there are stimulus-oriented models, which we will not go into detail, but mainly it says, okay, there is a stimuli, and whatever this is what stress is. And it doesn't really matter what I feel about it, but the stimulus is important. And then we have this very important model of cognitive transactional model of stress by Lazarus and Volkmann. And about that, we will also talk more into detail. So let's start with those reaction-oriented models that, as I said, focus on what's happening in our body. And there is this concept of homeostasis, and this is also, it's from Cannon, and it's even before Hans Selye's model. And this model it's also from a biological perspective, as you can imagine. And it's quite interesting because it's still something that is considered as quite important on different levels. And the idea behind this is quite interesting because it basically says there's this principle of homeostasis. So the idea that everything in the body has a certain steady state. So a state that your body feels most comfortable with, and everything is fine, everything is in order, everything is the way it's supposed to be. But then when stress hits, then everything is, going around and all tangled up and not the way it's supposed to be, because cortisol is going up and adrenaline is going up and your blood flow is going up. And the idea is that homeostasis should be achieved. So we should go back to the steady state. However, the principle of homeostasis basically also says, or the idea of the fight or flight reaction is based on this concept of homeostasis. Again, there's this relevance that stress is important to mobilize us to fight or to fly. So to, try to grab your opponent or go away. And depending on the sport you're doing, one or the other is quite important. So this concept is very well established and referred to a lot. And Hans Selye, who's also a biologist, he studied medicine, and he's also very interested in how the hormones flow through our body. He said, yes, this is interesting and this is important. However, he was more interested in long-lasting effects of stress. So basically what we would call today chronic effects of stress. And he designed the stress adaptation model, which has basically 3 phases. As you can see here, you are in an alarm phase. So the sympathetic nervous system goes up and, reacts and things are going on. And then there's this phase where you resist. So that's where you perform. That's where you try very hard, even within a competition or during training or during studying for exam or even performing the exam. And then, and this is a very important phase, number 3, the exhaustion phase. So this is when you're done with everything, when you can calm down and when you can relax. And what's interesting about his model is that he says, okay, it is important that we relax. And when we don't do that, our physiological resources, and it's okay that he only refers to physiological resources because he's basically from a biological perspective. He says if we have a too long-lasting resistance phase, so if we are stressed too long and there is, for example, so much release of cortisol, the stress hormone, and our coping efforts are so high and we have to keep it up all the time, and there is again then always this resistance phase and always we have to perform, and then potentially there are even new stressors coming, then our physiological resources, they just decline. And this, even way back then, he said, is not good for our health, and actually very, very bad for our health, but also very, very bad for our performance in general. And now we can also say it's very bad for our well-being in general. So those are 2 models that focus basically on the physiological reaction of stress, or consider this stress. But of course, we are here focusing on sports psychology, so you probably wonder, okay, that cannot be enough, there has to be more, and there is more, of course. we have the cognitive transactional model of stress. Always sounds very fancy, but it's actually quite simple. Cognitive means, okay, there is something that we think about. Transaction means, well, it's not just what's happening in our mind that we think about something, but it's always related to the environment. So there's this back and forth between the environment that I operate in and, well, a model and stress now we defined. So let's go through this model step by step and try to figure it out. So we start with a situation or a stimulus. Basically, well, we have a competition. Let's focus on sport. We have a competition that is quite important to us. So we start and we have a cognitive appraisal. So we think about what's going on. We are in this situation and we think, okay, is this situation somehow relevant for us? And if we think about it's a final, it's an important competition, of course it's relevant for us. If it would be irrelevant or even very pleasant, then it wouldn't really lead to stress and it would just be okay, fine. And the second appraisal that we do is we evaluate the resources that we have to handle the stressor. Basically, did I prepare well enough? How is my opponent? Can I beat him or her? How am I feeling today? Do I have a good feeling about my body? Am I ready to hit the ball the way I like it? And those two things, the primary and secondary appraisal together, they basically then define the situation as stressful. So if a situation is, or in the primary appraisal, I consider a situation as very important, but in the secondary appraisal, I feel like I really can handle this and this is really, really something well. This still can lead to stress, but I can then, in the second step, for me, acknowledge it as something that is a challenge, rather than some athletes also do, and they feel threatened by the situation. And it's quite interesting because we know from a various amount of research that if we cognitively appraise a situation as a challenge, we actually perform better as if we would appraise it as a threat. And one final remark on the primary and secondary appraisal, because Lazarus wrote somewhere that he was actually quite upset that he named it primary and secondary, because he didn't want to suggest, or it suggests that the primaries happen first and the secondaries happening second, and this is just not true. He wanted to actually convey the message that both is happening at the same time and also impact each other. So if all that has happened and we landed that this is a challenge or a threat, the loss damage part is for other situations where you can actually physically get harmed. And then we go to the second stage of the coping. So this is, within Lazarus, there's not only stress, but he also goes to the way of how can I solve this problem. There are two strategies that we will focus on in a second. And then in the next step, after we have basically tried to cope with those situations, we have a reappraisal. And for the example I talked about earlier, we are 0-4 behind in a tennis set. We try to, now focus more on the tactic the opponent uses. And now we think, okay, his backhand is really bad, and if I hit a slice there very easily, then he's not going down so much, and then he will have problems in hitting the ball. And then actually this works. And then the situation, of course, with the reappraisal, it then changes. And then it basically starts again. We have a new situation and we say, okay, how is the situation? How is the evaluation of our individual resources? And what kind of coping strategies can we use to handle the situation? So it's basically kind of a circle, and it goes round and round and round. And the way we could cope with stressors are, they're, depending on the author, there are different coping strategies, but Lazarus focuses on two: the problem-focused coping and the emotion-focused coping. With the problem-focused coping, this is more of a cognitive approach. So what I just said, you focus on the strategy of the opponent, and then you might find actually solutions for the problem. and you generate other solutions if that doesn't work in the next round of reappraising a situation. What is important, that the problem-focused coping should actually, or basically says, you should not reject avoidance strategies, and you should contribute to other goals. And what you also should not try to do is to, or what should not happen is that you have blockages, meaning that you don't have any ideas, because this would make it extremely difficult, and then potentially an emotion-focused coping would be more relevant for you. And emotion-focused coping is quite, well, it's not simple, but it's different, and it depends very much on the type of person you are, because there it's more the affective approach and the affective access. So you try to manage your emotions. You're in a stressful situation that you perceive as stressful, and for example, you try to relax, you try to breathe, you even try to divert yourself and focus on something else. You can, for example, also try to deny that you're in a situation, or what you can do is, for example, using self-talk to really ensure that you can handle this, and that you have the ability to act, and that you're well prepared, and that you should not be afraid, and that you can handle this. So those type of coping is what is out there, according at least to Latzos and Volkmann. And to focus a bit more on sport, I brought you this study because I just think it's always helpful, especially as a coach, if you listen as a coach, to know that there are other coaches out there that have the same stressors. And this was an interview study with 11 very professional coaches from soccer, cricket, rugby, hockey, golf, gymnastics, sailing. And what they found is, or what the authors found, is that there are over 180 stressors. And they try to organize them in those three aspects. And for example, performance-related issues when it comes to the athletes is something that is a stressor for coaches. For example, the athlete doesn't listen to what I'm saying. This is very stressful for me. Or the training was not very well. Or, oh, I know that he's not good in a competition, and this is stressing me out as a coach. On the other hand, also performance-related issues for coaches, him or herself. For example, the training itself, you know that the training wasn't well prepared and lacked kind of a structure, and you weren't really prepared. But besides that, there's also so much pressure that you as a coach perceive from parents, from athletes, or even from officials. So there's so much that is kind of, stressing you out as a coach as well. And one final one is that they're put together as organizational, environmental stressors, travel, finance, the administration of things. So there's also those issues around the performance. It's a very big one, the organizational ones. But also, as an athlete, there are a lot of stressors. And here I just put down a couple of them because it's important as a coach, but also as an athlete to know that they're out there. So the high training volumes, the idea of, oh my God, is there an overtraining? Also from a physiological perspective, but also from a psychological perspective. As an athlete, or athletes generally, they don't always have a choice of, okay, today I want to train this, and today I want to start my practice at 4 and not at 5 as it is scheduled. So there is little room for self-determination, so the autonomy or the felt competences, but also the relationships that kind of struggle with that. And then there is this very new, or at least newer approach, or a source of pressure, the media and the social media especially. And depending on the age of the athlete, of course, the double burden of, okay, I have to go to school and I have to prepare my homework, but I also have to compete and I also have to practice and train. So when we think about all that, all the stressors that athletes and coaches have, it is quite important, and I said it earlier, that we also consider recovery. Because if we don't consider recovery, what happens is what is here proposed in the so-called scissor model, overtraining, fatigue, injuries, all those sorts of things. And just very briefly, just to give you an idea what this model proposes is, you have a certain capacity for stress. So this is the stress you can handle. You have a certain resource limit. So this is as far as you can go. This is something that we also heard, at least from a physiological resources, from Hans Selye in his model. And basically, it is related to the model of Hans Selye if we think about it, because if you have more and more stressors, it's just, you know, the stress capacities that you need in order to recover are getting so big, and the resources that you have are getting so low that the scissor basically is growing apart all the time. And this then leads to overtraining, to fatigue, or to injuries. So it's very important that we consider recovery more and more in our training schedules. So what is recovery? Recovery is basically defined as an inter-individual and intra-individual multi-level process in time for the re-establishment of performance abilities. This basically means it differs within an individual what the person needs. So sometimes I need this type of recovery, sometimes I need that type of recovery, and it also differs between individuals. So it's not something that we can say to a whole training group, okay, you do this. It is very, very different. What is important though, and this is different to, okay, it's just, you know, we're gonna go for a swim after a training match because it's so much fun. No, we're gonna go and have, I don't know, so we're gonna swim for 10 minutes in that pace because it's intentional and it's planned and it's a controlled process. This is recovery and not just, okay, we do this for fun. It doesn't mean that doing this for fun cannot also be recovering, but it's not what we consider recovery. Okay, so recovery is also a process in time, and it depends on the type of and duration of stress. So depending on what type of activity you had, what type of training you had, what type of stressor there was, how intense the stressor was, so that's the next point, it needs to be adapted to this. And then of course it's closely linked to the situational conditions, and this also means what kind of possibilities you have there. All right, so let's see what type of recovery forms there are, and you can already check what type of recovery you like the best. So there is this active type of recovery or active form of recovery that is basically the stretching, the swimming, so a reduced physical activity. And then there's this passive type that's basically inactivity or passive methods like cold water immersions, but also going to the sauna, and that's personally my favorite. And then there is this proactive type where it's about increasing personal resources way before a stressor actually happens. So let's see how they work. There is an immense amount of studies that Maya, Ferrauti, Kellman, and Pfeiffer did in the last years here in Germany. And what they found is basically that the sauna, for example, was not effectful on performance, also not cold water immersions. Breathing, however, was. Power naps were great. Massages were good, also a passive form. And comprehension clothing, so those tight clothes, those were also good for performance increasement. But I want to say, from a sport psychological perspective, going to the sauna, and maybe I just say this because I like the sauna so much, but for me, it's not only about the performance that you can bring on the court, for example, the next day, but it's also about how you feel and how you handle, from a psychological perspective, the match that you, for example, had the day. And for me, sauna is one of the greatest recovery strategies of all times. But the point is, you know, there were many athletes, there were professional athletes that they observed and questioned. And at least from a performance perspective, those are the results. Nevertheless, as I said, there are inter-individual differences. So for one person, this might work, and for the other person, it doesn't. So it's important that we figure out what works for whom. So what we can see here is that there are basically physiological strategies, so for short-term regeneration and recovery. But what we are missing are somehow psychological or more mentally focused strategies, even though we would consider breathing to be a psychological strategy. So I want to give you one example of a psychological strategy that can help, that has become more and more of interest also in sports psychology in the recent years, is the so-called undoing hypothesis. I try to make it as quickly as possible. Basically, it says that positive emotions, they don't really have an action tendency. No one really knows what's happening with positive emotions or what they're good for, but we kind of like them. And Fredrickson suggests, yes, positive emotions are good to undo the effects of negative emotions, and thereby balancing out the autonomic activation to regain mid-range levels. Basically meaning to come back, or positive emotions are useful to recover quicker from a physiological perspective. From a physiological perspective, there are quite mixed results on that. It's not quite clear if it's really true or not. But the idea of the undoing hypothesis has also now been adapted to psychological recovery, so that they say, okay, but you also recover faster from negative emotions, in terms of that you faster will feel better from a psychological perspective. And there is evidence that actually found that after a psychosocial stressor, so what we did here is we stressed individuals that they would be evaluated and that other will watch them. So this psychosocial effect that you have in a competition that is sometimes stressful, you know, that there are so many people watching and maybe there's this one person that isn't watching that you like so much and that you want to impress, but that is judging you. Or you're a young soccer player and there is a scout and you really want to see how he is going, or you really want to tell him that you really want to show him that you're doing a great job. And apparently, at least that's what we found, is that after this psychosocial stressor, when we induce positive emotions by an imagery exercise, we found that they recover faster in terms of psychological recovery. We didn't find that if we stressed them physiologically. We put them on a bike and they were, riding the bike as fast as possible. We didn't find that, which makes sense. But what we also found is, at least in the direction, that when we had a simulated competition, so we told divers that they were in a competition, and then half of the group of the divers were watching actually a video of kittens. So it's very cute. They were 11 to 12 years old and they were all females. So we adapted the way how to induce positive emotions. And when they watched this, they actually showed that they, even though not statistically, but the descriptive results confirmed the idea that they recover faster from a psychological perspective. So they had higher levels of positive emotions after watching this kitten video in comparison to the other group that just watched the dripping water. Exactly. So there are ideas that inducing positive emotions can actually lead to a faster recovery in terms of a mental or psychological recovery. And then, as I said earlier, there are also ways for proactive recovery, and there are a lot that we cannot go into detail, but that you will go into detail in other teaching units. That is nutrition and hydration. Of course, if you eat and drink well, also sleep and rest is quite an important issue. Then there is this sense of resilience, so that you learn to bounce back. Then there is this idea of salutogenesis, meaning that everything in life makes sense. If you have this, which you can practice, then you also deal better with stressful situations. And there are relaxation techniques that is autogenic training, progressive muscle relaxation, that all breathing exercises that all can help you to deal better with stress in the acute situation, but also in the situation where you don't even react that strongly to a stressor. And then, of course, a very important one is physical activity. I made a circle around it because this, of course, is only to a certain extent helpful for professional athletes because they are physically active. However, for normal people, and it very much depends on who you are working with, but for normal people, a certain amount of physical exercise is quite important to actually buffer stressful situations. So in that sense, I want to say thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you soon.